Okay, next up, Michael Rogner. Michael is an associate science director at River Partners. He has spent 2 decades working on the Sacramento River floodplain and has designed and implemented thousands of acres of riparian habitat restoration. As associate science director of River Partners, he leads teams of 20 restoration scientists implementing large-scale ecosystem restoration projects throughout the state. Prior to his current employment, Michael was an avian ecologist at Point Blue Conservation Science, where he led research into migratory songbird utilization of restored riparian habitats. He holds a bachelor's degree from Florida State University. His current work in ecology and conservation includes many projects focused on groundwater water recharge, floodplain reconnection, climate resiliency, and plant and wildlife recovery. The title of his presentation is Floodplain Restoration on Disconnected Gravel Bars in the Sacramento Watershed. Let's welcome Michael.
Thanks, Joe, for that introduction. So I first was introduced to Joe many years ago. It was up on Table Mountain. It was my very first day in California working. And Joe was up there and he's running around like a crazy man taking pictures of all the vernal pool species. And then afterwards he wanted to go out and drink beer and talk about flowers. And I was like, all right, this is my kind of guy. I like this guy. And over the course of the last 20 years or so, I was lucky enough to work on him with some habitat restoration projects, along with Tom Griggs, one of which I am going to talk about today. But before I do that, our communication staff insists that I say a word about River Partners, and I don't want to make them angry. Let's see here. So River Partners, we're a nonprofit founded by a couple of conservation-minded farmers who many of you know. Our mission is to bring life back to rivers, and we've been working for about 26 years. The size of the circle kind of indicates how many projects we've done in each of those watersheds. These are some of the metrics that we like to sort of measure ourselves on. We've planted about 4 million trees or so and restored about 19,000 acres of riparian habitat. And if you've never seen our projects, this is kind of what they look like. They're all in the Central Valley. Everything in this picture would have been alfalfa fields probably about 10 years ago or so. And now it's 2,000 plus acres of riparian forest. And as of January 1st, the land transfer was completed to state parks, and now it's California's newest state park in like 15 years or something. And they're thank you, yeah. And you can go out there, they're doing tours. You just have to sign up for them while they're building the infrastructure to bring people out and access the site. The project that I'm going to be talking about today is up here, up near Red Bluff. It's at the Sacramento River National Wildlife Refuge, the La Barranca unit. We restored about 300 plus acres of riparian forest using 45,000 trees and shrubs, a bunch of herbaceous plugs. Looks like I got an extra 0 on the grass there. It should be 2,800 pounds, not 28,000. Although I'm sure the seed supplier would have been really happy if it was 28,000. And I'm just going to focus for today's talk. I'm not going to talk about any of that other stuff. I'm just going to talk about the study that we did using late summer wildflower seeds. So on your left, that's sort of what the site conditions looked like prior to us working. The soil conditions are so bad, just really coarse material, that it barely, even in wet years, it barely grows annual grasses. The mustard in the picture, is like 6 inches tall. It doesn't look like your typical weedy field that you see throughout much of the Central Valley. And then on your right is an aerial photo taken in 1938. Our site there is circled, and then the river is indicated by that red arrow. And you can imagine the river back then sort of meandering back and forth across the floodplain. At some point in the not too distant past, the river had likely run right along the western edge of our project area, and our project area would have been a point bar, and then the river at some point meandered back. Bonus points, anybody who knows what else was happening on the Sac River in 1938, we were building this monstrosity. So as we know, dams kill rivers. The dam, in conjunction with hundreds of miles of rock revetment on the banks, has basically locked the river into place. It no longer behaves much like a river. It doesn't move around like rivers want to do. And so what we see out on the landscape today is basically a time capsule of what the river alignment would have been, back in the 30s and 40s. So that presents some interesting challenges for people who are trying to do restoration in this landscape. It's just so highly altered the way that it functions. The first thing that we do when we start a new project is we get a backhoe and we go and start digging around and looking at the soils. We knew from past experience that we could have planted in this little 7-acre gravel bar. We could have planted some trees and shrubs, and as long as they were on irrigation, they probably would have done fine. And then you turn the irrigation off and you go back 10 years later, 20 years later, and all of it would be gone. It would have reverted back to this field of invasive annual grasses. And so Joe and I were interested in finding something that would be a little more resilient, finding some plants that would stick around, providing wildlife habitat on a scale of decades rather than just a few years. Why we were standing out there talking about this stuff, these projects, because of the funding, have a very short window in which you get to actually implement them. So you don't have a ton of time to do a bunch of planning. So we just had to make decisions on the fly. This picture would have been taken in October of 2012, and there was a big storm coming. And there was like 40-mile-an-hour winds, a bunch of rain, and we knew that whatever seed was left on these herbaceous plants that we wanted to collect was probably not going to be there after the storm passed. Our other alternative would have been to call up one of the seed companies and purchase seed, but what we had seen from past experience is that some of these seeds that have been collected elsewhere in the watershed, and this is really the whole key point of this entire talk, is that those seeds, when you put them out on the landscape, they might do really well in the short term. You go out there 2 years later and you're like, wow, this project is awesome, it looks great. And then you go 3 or 4 years after that and it's all gone, because those seeds are not adapted to the site conditions. The harsher the conditions are, the more I think this sort of rings true. You have to be using seed that is locally collected and adapted to your site. And so with this storm in mind, I called Alikio, who is our field foreman, and he's really interested in working on new plants. And I said, I hope you don't have any plans for the weekend, because we need you to go out and collect a bunch of seed. And so he put together a crew. Joe and I drove around the refuge, found other locations that had conditions similar to our site, and saw what native plants were growing there. We gave him a list, and he went out and he was able to collect 41 pounds of 7 different species. And so 2 of the species, the Grandelia and the Heterotheca, the telegraph weed, we had used before, and we knew that they would do fairly well in these conditions. And then the other 5 species were brand new, or new to us. And so typically when we planted this stuff, we would be mixing it all up and spreading it across the landscape and just sort of letting itself sort it out. But since these were new species to us, we wanted to have it be a little more of a controlled environment. So we basically set up different bins that these seeds would be broadcast in. Each species was isolated from the others. Not true isolation, but just, there were none of these areas had multiple species in them, except for one. I should mention, we ended up collecting an 8 species, a tarweed, which I'm not really going to talk about because we put a little bit out on the landscape, and then the next year we went back and it was everywhere. And it was obviously not from the seed that we had broadcast, but it had been, on site, and we just hadn't seen it because it had probably been, a poor year. In terms of maintenance, we really didn't do anything. We didn't do any weed control. We didn't do any irrigation. The only thing that we would consider maintenance is if you think about this 7-acre parcel sort of carved out of 300 acres of woodland that was being restored at the same time, we had to do a lot of soil prep in those other areas. And so as we were driving the tractor with the disc behind it around prepping the soils, we kind of drove back and forth across this 7 acres. And because it was so rocky, you probably wouldn't even know that it had been disked unless you knew it. You could kind of see little lines in the soil. And this turned out to actually be pretty important because when we saw the germination, the winds and rain and whatever had washed the seed sort of into these low points, these grooves. And so we saw a lot of this sort of like linear germination, and it's a technique that we just sort of discovered by accident, and we still use it today on sites with similar conditions. So for the monitoring data that I'm going to talk about, I should point out that we've had numerous studies done out here. I saw Dr. Kaczynski somewhere out there in the crowd. Some of her students have done some research projects on this. We've had the Xerces Society. Point Blue has done some work out there. But for what I'm interested in, I'm really need to like dumb it down to my level and focus on like if we put these plants on the landscape, will they persist? Because that's the only thing that really matters to me as a practitioner. If the answer is no, then I don't really care about all of the other things that we can learn about these plants, because I need to be working with plants that can survive the way that we implement projects. And so for monitoring, we did a number of techniques, but for this one that I'm talking about today, we just set up these really simple 1 square meter plots. We were doing stem counts of the planted species, just randomly sampled across the various bins. We began the monitoring in 2013, which would have been the first year after germination. And then starting in 2014, we've been revisiting the site every other year, so in all the evenly numbered years. So 2024, this will be our next opportunity to go out and add another year to the data. So for the results of the individual species, I'll start with the annuals, who we sort of expect that they're going to have a lot of bad years followed with intermittent sort of booms, which is exactly what we've seen here with vinegar weed in 2020. It had a good year. Sorry, let me back up just for a second. The last point there, the goal of this, based on when we had driven around the refuge and seen all the other sites, was we were thinking that if you could get about 1 plant per square meter in these soil conditions, that is what we would consider to be a success. That, and combined with long-term durability of these plants, so they're not just getting out-competed by weeds. So that 1 per square meter, keep that in mind as we're going through the results. The vinegar weed, it's had basically 1 good year aside from the first year, and then the rest of the years it's been present, but not overly abundant. The same thing could be said about the spikeweed. 2016, it had a big year where it was just everywhere, and since then it's been hovering around like 1 to 3 plants per square meter. And the cool thing about that plant, since it's essentially just a tiny little tumbleweed, is it's spread throughout the entire project. And we've done some research on how these plants are exactly moving around the project. But I don't have time to cover that today, but this is certainly one of the stars. As we get into species that have a longer lifespan, the naked buckwheat has sort of settled in, right around like 1.5 plants per square meter, so we'd consider that to be a success. The Wright's buckwheat has done better. It's around 2.5 to 4 or so. And this plant, because of the structure in which it grows, provides lots of habitat, especially for wintering songbirds who tend to spend a lot of time on the ground, hunting for seeds and trying not to get eaten by hawks and, all of those things. And so when you go out there in the wintertime, if you go out there right now, you'd be flushing doves and all sorts of different sparrows out from underneath the Wright's buckwheat. It's been really fun to watch. The Grandelia, again, it's somewhere just above what our goal is. We had a hunch that this would do well just because we had used this plant a lot in the past. And the same thing goes with the telegraph weed. The one interesting thing about this one is that when we went out there in 2018, it was gone. Like, you couldn't find a single stem on the entire 7 acres. And since then, it started coming back. The final species of the 7 is the golden aster, which is kind of fascinating because it did not germinate at all in the first year, and since then it's sort of seen a steady increase. And when I was out there this past fall in 23, I wasn't collecting any data, but it's definitely becoming more and more abundant on the site, so I'd expect that trend to keep going up. So next steps, what did we learn from this? We took that 7 acres, we expanded it to 50 acres at Orville Wildlife Area, where we've had similar success, and now we're planting at Rancho Briscoe, which is a Bureau of Land Management property at the mouth of Battle Creek, and we're looking at about 150 acres. We've tested out a bunch of new species. We found 3 or 4 which have done well, and we will continue to add to that. And then we're expanding the wildlife monitoring that we're doing a lot with the Xerces Society, as well as looking at other wildlife. And I think that with that, I'm out of time, just at the right time. We do have time for questions? Great. Thank you.
For your revegetation methods, I was curious about the planting strategy for those 6 species and why they were planted in those swaths.
So the way that we planted them was just with a seed. Patrick would know the name of this thing, but it's just a piece of equipment you pull behind a tractor that spins seeds out. And the reason that we chose to isolate in bins is because we didn't want them competing against each other. The way that we plant now is we mix them all together now that we know that they're not going to outcompete each other. But at the time we weren't sure, and so we wanted to keep them separate.
Did you amplify seeds at all, or did you just direct seed what you had collected? It seemed like a lot of seed.
That's a great question. So one of the limiting factors in habitat restoration, especially in the valley, is lack of plant material. Heritage Growers is helping to solve that problem. We were not able to amplify the seed at the time, but now that has totally changed. Now we can take seed to Heritage Growers, and they can grow out whatever we want and whatever volume we want, and they're helping to solve some of those problems.
There seems to be a drop in density with all of your species, and then a stabilization. What's going on there?
My hunch in that first year, you've got all this fresh seed, and you're gonna get a big boom, right at the beginning. Where it's stabilized is sort of the interesting question to me. The way the abundance is now looks very similar to the sort of reference sites, and so there's something going on with the plants, the soils, the site conditions that seems to be the sort of carrying capacity for these plants.
Thank you.
Time for one more, if anybody. Otherwise, thank you.
Question from one of the online folks. Has the site had any natural recruitment from your selected species?
Yes, if I'm understanding the question, we are monitoring how far those species are spreading across the site, and it's measured in like hundreds of meters. It's a fairly good amount of recruitment, if you will. Thank you, and thank you for supporting the botanists.
Thank you, Michael.